They told you religion was about salvation. They told you it was about love, mercy, and forgiveness. But the truth is, religion in the hands of the powerful has always been a weapon, not a bridge to heaven, but a chain that keeps men crawling on their knees. Most men still don't see it. They think the cross was only a symbol of faith, but for centuries it was also the symbol of fear, used not to save men's souls but to enslave their minds. Every empire in history understood one truth. It's easy to control a man's body with violence. But if you can control his belief, if you can convince him that obedience is holy, you no longer need the whip. He'll build his own cage and call it righteousness. That's how slavery survived under the shadow of the cross, not because men were chained to the ground, but because their spirits were shackled to a corrupted idea of God. Slave owners didn't just own bodies, they owned belief. They twisted the language of heaven to justify the horrors of earth. They told the slave that Christ demanded submission, that suffering was virtue, that obedience to one's master was obedience to God himself, and in doing so they rewrote the meaning of morality. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about this exact sickness. He called it slave morality, a system built not on strength but on guilt, not on truth but on fear. Nietzsche saw what most never dared to say out loud. Religion, when hijacked by the weak and the powerful alike, turns the will to power into the will to obey. And the tragedy is that it disguises submission as virtue. The ancient world worshipped strength. Greek philosophy celebrated excellence, arete, the pursuit of greatness in body, mind, and spirit. But when the Roman Empire fused politics with Christianity, the message shifted. The cross became an emblem not of liberation but of loyalty. You weren't told to become strong, you were told to be meek. You weren't taught to think, you were told to believe. And belief became the most profitable form of control ever invented. Slave owners didn't need Nietzsche to teach them this. They lived it. They quoted scripture while whipping men bloody. They baptized children in the name of the same God who blessed their chains. They built churches on plantations, where sermons were carefully crafted not to awaken rebellion but to anesthetize it. The message was simple: obey, suffer, wait for heaven, and the tragedy is, it worked. Men were broken, generation after generation, by the soft poison of divine order. Even today, that poison lingers. Modern men still kneel to invisible masters, bosses, governments, ideologies, all justified in the language of morality. They still believe suffering is noble, that humility is sacred, that questioning authority is sinful, because the slave religion never died. It only changed form. Carl Jung once said that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And the idea of obedience, rooted in religious fear, still possesses modern man. It whispers that power is evil, that ambition is pride, that resistance is sin. But here's what they don't tell you. The same faith that could make you free can also make you blind. It all depends on who holds the pen that writes the commandments. History shows us that whenever the powerful need control, they sanctify submission. They turn rebellion into heresy and silence into virtue. That's how medieval kings ruled in God's name. That's how colonizers justified conquest. And that's how plantation masters baptized their slaves before chaining them to labor. Because the moment you can convince a man that God approves of his suffering, you can own his destiny. But the wise men, those who refused to bow, saw through the illusion. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, wrote that the only true freedom lies within the mind. He ruled an empire, yet warned that the greatest tyranny is spiritual dependence. A free man, he said, obeys reason, not superstition. His virtue is chosen, not commanded. Contrast that with what slave owners preached. They didn't want men to think. They wanted men to worship their chains. And the deeper tragedy, those chains were polished with scripture. Most men still carry invisible versions of those same chains. They obey systems they don't understand. They suffer quietly, believing patience is holy. They suppress their strength to be accepted by a world that fears masculine power. And every Sunday they kneel, believing submission is sacred, never realizing they're reenacting the psychology of the slave. The question is not whether God exists. The question is who speaks in his name. Because the truth is, every institution that craves obedience will eventually drape itself in sacred language. Every tyrant will quote scripture. And every weak man will call his fear faith. The philosophers who understood this, Nietzsche, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, they were condemned as heretics. Because they dared to tell the truth. That religion, when corrupted, doesn't save man, it pacifies him. It turns his will to live into the will to obey. It baptizes weakness and calls it virtue. And yet somewhere in that corruption lies a buried truth. The original message wasn't slavery, it was strength. Christ himself spoke of inner kingdom, of spirit over system, of truth that sets men free. But men with power could never tolerate a faith that made others equal to them. So they crucified not just the man, but the meaning. They tore truth from the cross and replaced it with fear. And so the question remains, are you living by the faith of a free man, or the obedience of a slave? Because history has shown us one thing beyond doubt. The most dangerous chains are not made of iron. They are made of belief. Power has always searched for a mask, something to hide behind while it conquers, manipulates, and consumes. For kings, it was divine right. For politicians, it's democracy. For the modern world, it's morality. But in the ancient world, no mask was more perfect than religion. Because religion could do what no army ever could. It could make men want to obey. It could turn conquest into faith and domination into destiny. It could chain men's souls while convincing them they were free. Every empire that ever existed eventually discovered this secret. The Egyptians called their rulers sons of the sun. The Babylonians built temples that doubled as power centers. And Rome perfected it. They realized that the surest way to hold an empire together wasn't by force, but by faith. When Rome adopted Christianity, it wasn't an act of devotion, it was an act of genius. Constantine saw that the same religion which had once threatened the empire could now preserve it. The same symbol that defied authority could now justify it. In a single stroke, he transformed the cross from a weapon of rebellion into a symbol of obedience. And from that moment on, faith became empire's most loyal servant. Nietzsche called it the taming of man, a process where the wild, instinctive, strong-willed individual, the natural aristocrat of spirit, was domesticated through morality. He was taught that his instincts were evil, that his strength was sinful, that his suffering was proof of virtue, and thus religion became the perfect leash, one that didn't restrain the body but the will. But here's what they don't tell you. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was designed. Because when rulers realized that belief could be weaponized, they no longer needed legions, they needed priests. They no longer needed chains, they needed scriptures. And every word of those scriptures could be interpreted to serve power. Obedience became sacred, doubt became sin, and submission became the highest form of devotion. Aristotle once said that every system of control must convince its subjects that the hierarchy is natural, that those on top are ordained, and those below are chosen to serve. Religion provided that illusion better than any philosophy ever could. It didn't just claim power was natural, it claimed it was divine. Slave owners in the American South understood this perfectly. They didn't invent the theology of control, they inherited it. When they quoted Ephesians, "Servants, obey your masters as you would obey Christ," they weren't spreading religion. They were preserving hierarchy. They were using heaven to justify hell. And it worked because the doctrine of obedience had already been sanctified centuries earlier. Think about that. Long before a single whip cracked, the psychological foundation of slavery was already built in sermons, cathedrals, and scripture. By the time the plantation was born, the slave's mind was already prepared to kneel. That's the power of belief. It programs before it punishes. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, later called this disciplinary power. He argued that modern society no longer needed visible chains because men had internalized their own policing. The church had trained them to feel guilt even when no one was watching. They became their own wardens. And that's the terrifying genius of religious control. It makes obedience self-sustaining. But power never stops evolving. As religion's grip weakened, new faiths emerged. The nation, the market, the algorithm. Different gods, same obedience. Modern man may laugh at the church, but he worships just as blindly. He kneels before productivity, status, and approval. He checks his phone more faithfully than his ancestors prayed. He lives in constant fear of being judged, no longer by God, but by society. And that's why Nietzsche warned, God is dead, and we have killed him. He didn't mean that divinity itself had died, he meant that we had replaced it with hollow idols. That man, in his arrogance, had dethroned the sacred only to crown the social. He stopped fearing hell, but he started fearing irrelevance. Power simply changed its robes. It moved from the pulpit to the screen, from the priest to the influencer, from the sermon to the algorithm. And yet the mechanism is identical, obedience disguised as meaning. But the wise man sees the pattern. He understands that the architecture of control has always depended on one formula: fear plus faith. Obedience, fear of punishment. Faith and authority, together they create a man who submits without question. And this is where the masculine spirit begins to rot, because a man who cannot question the sacred will never question the corrupt. A man taught to kneel will never learn to stand. And when generations of men are trained to believe that virtue equals compliance, civilization becomes a plantation of polite slaves. That's why history's freest minds were always branded as heretics. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth. Giordano Bruno was burned alive for suggesting the universe was infinite. Spinoza was excommunicated for saying that God and nature were one. They weren't punished for falsehood. They were punished for independence. Because every system built on control must destroy the man who dares to think freely. The Stoics understood this long before Christianity. They believed virtue was the alignment of reason and will, not submission to authority. To them, obedience without understanding was cowardice. They believed that to serve truth, one must first be willing to offend lies. That's what separated the philosopher from the believer. The philosopher questions, even God; the believer obeys, even tyranny, and that's why power has always preferred the believer. The birth of religious control wasn't a war of swords, it was a war of ideas. And the empire won by convincing man that his chains were holy, that to disobey was not just rebellion against man, but blasphemy against God. Once that illusion took root, the rest was inevitable. Slavery became divine order. Kings became chosen. Suffering became sacred. And the man who asked why became dangerous. But the truth is simple, and it always has been. No man is born to kneel. Obedience is learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. The same scriptures that were twisted to enslave can also awaken. Because hidden within every doctrine of control lies the seed of liberation. The idea that truth cannot be owned, and faith cannot be forced. That's the paradox the masters feared most. They could command prayer but not thought. They could own the body but not the will. And once a man rediscovers that, once he sees through the illusion, he becomes untouchable. The man who obeys out of fear is a slave. The man who obeys out of understanding is free. The difference is not in the act, it's in the consciousness behind it. Religion became power's greatest ally because it taught men to fear their own freedom. But philosophy, real philosophy, exists to remind you that freedom is the first law of the soul. And once a man reclaims that truth, no priest, no ruler, and no system will ever command him again. Fear is the oldest religion. Before temples were built, before prophets spoke, men worshipped what they feared. Thunder, death, chaos, the unknown. Fear gave birth to gods, and gods gave birth to control. But here's the dark genius of power. It learned to domesticate fear, to refine it, to transform it from an external terror into an internal voice. That voice became guilt. You see, physical chains can be broken, but guilt is eternal. It doesn't rust, it doesn't age, it doesn't sleep. It follows you into silence, into solitude, into your dreams. And for centuries, rulers and priests used guilt as the invisible leash of the soul. They told men that they were born wrong, that desire itself was sin, that their nature was corrupt and their thoughts impure. And from that lie, a theology of fear was born. One that didn't just control what men did, but what they were allowed to feel. Nietzsche called it the inversion of values. He said Christianity took the instincts of the strong, pride, desire, ambition, and rebranded them as evil, while the traits of the weak, submission, humility, pity, were elevated as good. It was moral alchemy, a psychological conquest far greater than any empire's sword. Because once you convince a man that his strength is sin, you no longer need to conquer him. He will crucify himself in shame. And that's exactly what the theology of fear accomplished. It created a world where guilt replaced judgment, and self-condemnation replaced rebellion. But here's what they don't tell you. Guilt is not morality. It's control masquerading as conscience. Real morality requires awareness. Guilt requires obedience. Morality asks, what is right? Guilt whispers, you are wrong. The difference is everything. Carl Jung saw this clearly. He said that man's shadow, his instincts, his sexuality, his rage, his hunger for power, isn't evil. It's energy. And when you repress it, when you bury it beneath shame, it doesn't disappear, it festers. It becomes neurosis, addiction, despair. A man who cannot accept his darkness will eventually be ruled by it. That's what guilt does, and it fractures the soul. It divides man against himself. He becomes both prisoner and warden, sinner and judge, and he calls this inner war faith. Think of the medieval monk flagellating himself for impure thoughts. The priest terrified of his own lust. The slave who believes his pain is divine punishment. Each of them worships the same God, the God of guilt. A deity invented not by heaven but by hierarchy, because guilt is profitable. A guilty man seeks redemption. A fearful man seeks protection. And both will pay, with their money, their time, their obedience, for the illusion of forgiveness. History proves it. Indulgences in the Middle Ages were sold as divine receipts for grace. Priests turned sin into currency. The more you feared hell, the richer the church became. Religion became an economy of guilt, and guilt was its gold. But here's the bitter truth. The theology of fear didn't just imprison men in churches. It built invisible cathedrals in their minds. Even today, the modern man carries those same invisible altars. He feels guilty for resting, guilty for desiring, guilty for wanting power, sex, freedom, dominance, everything his nature was designed to crave. He's been conditioned to believe that virtue means self-denial, that to be good is to be weak, that to be spiritual is to be harmless. But harmlessness isn't holiness. It's impotence. Every great man in history, from Marcus Aurelius to Leonardo da Vinci, understood that mastery requires integration, not suppression. They didn't run from their instincts. They refined them. They turned desire into creativity, aggression into focus, ambition into purpose. They didn't pray their strength away. They sanctified it through discipline. That's the difference between a philosopher and a follower. A follower kneels in fear of his nature. A philosopher seeks to understand it. One obeys out of guilt. The other transforms through wisdom. Yet society still feeds on the theology of fear because it keeps men compliant. It's easier to manage a population that believes questioning is sin than one that demands truth. Easier to sell products to a man who feels unworthy than to one who feels whole. Easier to control men who are ashamed of their instincts than those who embrace them. That's why guilt has become industrialized. Modern religion doesn't live in temples. It lives in algorithms. Every scroll, every comparison, every filtered face is designed to trigger the same ancient mechanism. You are not enough. The old church said you were born a sinner. The new one says you're born inadequate. Different doctrine, same disease, and what's worse, most men believe it. They drown in quiet guilt for not earning enough, not looking enough, not being enough. They live in constant apology for existing, and that's exactly how power wants them, uncertain, insecure, and obedient. But the wise man rejects that inheritance. He sees guilt for what it is, a system, not a feeling, a method of control disguised as moral truth. He understands that redemption doesn't come from submission, but from self-knowledge. When Jung said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell," he meant that the man who denies his darkness can never know his light. To transcend guilt, you must first descend into honesty. You must confront every forbidden impulse, every unspoken desire, every shameful thought, and realize they are not demons to be exorcised, but energies to be integrated. Because the moment you stop apologizing for your nature, you reclaim your power. And that is what the theology of fear has always been designed to prevent. History shows it clearly. Free men don't ask for forgiveness. They seek understanding. They don't live to please gods or governments. They live to serve truth. And truth has never required guilt, only courage. That's why Nietzsche said, "The great man is not the one who denies guilt, but the one who transcends it." To transcend guilt is to reject manipulation. To reject manipulation is to reclaim your will. And to reclaim your will is to become what religion feared most, a man who thinks for himself. The theology of fear created obedient believers. Philosophy creates dangerous men, and history has always belonged to the dangerous. Slavery never ended. It only evolved. The chains became invisible, the masters changed their clothes, and obedience was renamed progress. Modern man calls himself free. He votes, he chooses, he posts. And he believes that this performance of choice equals liberty. But the truth is brutal. Freedom without consciousness is just a prettier kind of slavery. The ancient slave worked for survival. The modern slave works for validation. He is not whipped by his master. He is whipped by his own desires. Desires programmed into him by a system that learned over centuries how to enslave not through punishment but through pleasure. That's the genius of modern control. You no longer need to chain a man's body when you can sedate his will. You no longer need to silence him when you can drown him in noise. And you no longer need to forbid rebellion when you can make rebellion unprofitable. The plantation became the corporation. The priest became the influencer. The sermon became the algorithm. And the scripture became the endless scroll of distraction that keeps modern man docile, entertained, and exhausted. But here's what they don't tell you. The modern slave loves his chains. He polishes them. He brags about them. He calls them career, lifestyle, ambition. He doesn't even realize that every goal he chases was implanted into him by the same forces that profit from his exhaustion. Friedrich Nietzsche foresaw this evolution. He said that when God died, man would not become free, he would become lost. Because when the sacred collapses, something else must take its place, and that something became the system, a network of control that worships productivity, conformity, and comfort. It doesn't demand your faith in heaven, only your faith in progress. It doesn't ask for your soul, only your attention. And every click, every purchase, every dopamine hit is a prayer to the new gods of comfort and consumption. The irony. Modern man still serves. He just no longer knows whom. The philosopher Erich Fromm warned about this in Escape from Freedom. He said that when given the burden of true liberty, most people run back to authority. Because freedom is terrifying, it means responsibility. It means facing the chaos of your own existence without a script. So man, weak and uncertain, seeks comfort and structure, even if that structure enslaves him. That's how we arrived here. A civilization of obedient men who think they're free because their chains are self-chosen. They choose their careers, their distractions, their addictions, but not their purpose. Because purpose requires thought, and thought is rebellion. Carl Jung called this state psychic imprisonment, a condition where man's spirit is trapped by invisible forces he doesn't understand. He may have money, sex, power, but internally he's divided. He works tirelessly for approval while resenting those who gave him the script. He mistakes movement for progress, consumption for happiness, pleasure for meaning. This is the new slavery, not physical but psychological. And it's more efficient than anything in history because it's voluntary. In the old world, the slave dreamed of freedom. In the new world, he fears it. Because freedom would mean no excuses, no comfort, no validation, just raw confrontation with the self. And modern man has been trained to run from himself at all costs. That's why he needs constant distraction. Silence terrifies him. Because in silence, he might hear the truth, that everything he built his identity on is a lie. Most men think the system oppresses them from above. But the truth is darker. It lives inside them, in their fears, in their routines, in their need to be liked, in their endless hunger for approval. They are not prisoners of governments. They are prisoners of conditioning. And conditioning doesn't end with education. It begins there. Schools don't teach men how to think. They teach them what to think. They reward obedience, not curiosity. They prepare boys not to lead, but to comply. By the time a man enters adulthood, his spirit has already been domesticated. He confuses politeness with virtue, compliance with intelligence, busyness with purpose. This is why Marcus Aurelius said, "It is possible to be both emperor and slave." Because slavery isn't a political condition, it's a psychological one. A man can rule nations and still be enslaved to his fears, his lust, his greed, his reputation. And a man with nothing who thinks and acts freely is more sovereign than a king. But the system doesn't want sovereign men. It wants efficient slaves. Men who wake up tired, work obediently, consume endlessly, and die quietly. Men who confuse pleasure with fulfillment. Men who no longer believe in transcendence and only convenience. That's why philosophy has become the new rebellion. Because in a world where everything is engineered to keep you asleep, the act of thinking is revolutionary. To sit in silence, to question what everyone else accepts, to detach from the noise. These are not luxuries. They are acts of defiance. The modern slave doesn't need emancipation. He needs awareness. He doesn't need more rights. He needs more truth. Because truth is the one thing that breaks every invisible chain. History shows that every empire falls the moment its slaves wake up. Not when they fight, but when they see. When they realize the whip was never in another's hand, but in their own conditioned minds. The Stoics knew this long ago. Epictetus was born a slave, yet he taught that no man could truly own him. Because ownership ends at the body, the mind belongs to no one. And once a man discovers that, once he stops giving his power to approval, to fear, to systems, he becomes untouchable. But here's the catch. Awareness is painful. That's why so few pursue it. It burns illusions. It forces you to confront every comfort you once called truth. And that's why the system survives. Because men would rather suffer comfortably than awaken violently. Most men would rather die numb than live free. But the wise man understands that real freedom demands sacrifice, not of possessions but of illusions. He burns his false gods, status, validation, convenience, and rebuilds his soul on discipline, solitude, and truth, because freedom isn't given. It's forged, and the fire that forges it is awareness. That's why philosophy matters more today than ever before, not as theories but as rebellion. Because when you start to think for yourself, when you stop reacting like a trained subject, you cease to be profitable, predictable, and controllable. You become dangerous. And that's the one thing the system cannot tolerate, a man who has awakened from the dream of obedience. The chains are real, but the cage is not. For centuries, men have been told that freedom is external, that it is earned through obedience sanctioned by authority, or granted by God. But the truth is simple and terrifying. Freedom begins in the mind. And most men will never find it, because to find it, you must walk alone. You must confront every lie you have been taught, every fear you have inherited, every guilt you have swallowed, and that journey is forbidden. The masters of old feared it. Slave owners, kings, priests, even the empires themselves, all feared the man who discovered that the power they wielded was an illusion. Because a man who awakens is untouchable. He can no longer be commanded, manipulated, or controlled. He becomes sovereign, not because he rules others, but because he rules himself. Nietzsche called this the revaluation of values. It is the overturning of all the lies that have been dressed as truth. It is the recognition that God, law, morality, and society are not arbiters of virtue. They are instruments of control. The moment you see this clearly, you stop seeking permission to live, you stop kneeling for approval, and you stop apologizing for your own power. The Stoics knew this centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul's freedom cannot be given or taken. It is exercised. It is claimed. It is defended with vigilance, discipline, and courage. No external law can constrain it. No ideology can possess it. A man who has mastered himself is richer than an emperor, stronger than a king, and feared by every institution built on obedience. The wisdom of the ancients converges here. The God you have been told to worship exists, but not above you, not outside you. He exists within, and he has always been waiting for you to awaken. Every desire, every instinct, every shadow you were taught to suppress is not a sin. It is divine energy. It is the raw material of sovereignty. The anger you feel, the hunger for power, the lust for life, these are not weaknesses. They are indicators of strength. They are reminders that you were never meant to kneel. And yet most men will never see this. They will remain obedient, guilt-ridden, and distracted. They will worship at the altar of comfort. They will convince themselves that limitation is virtue, that fear is piety, that obedience is strength. But the wise man rejects all of it. He takes the fire that guilt has buried and uses it to forge himself anew. He embraces his instincts without shame. He confronts his shadow without fear. He builds a life rooted in truth, not in permission. This is forbidden liberation, because it requires you to step outside the narratives you were trained to believe. It requires you to defy comfort, to challenge authority, and to embrace the chaos within. It is not easy. It is not safe. And it is why so few men ever achieve it. History shows us the consequences. Every great man who reclaimed his power faced the wrath of the obedient. Socrates was executed. Giordano Bruno was burned. Nietzsche was condemned. Even the greatest empires trembled before men who refused to kneel, because the individual who stands untethered becomes a force no system can dominate. And make no mistake, this journey is dangerous. It will isolate you. It will make enemies of the comfortable, the complacent, and the fearful. It will force you to endure criticism, ridicule, and scorn, because the system cannot tolerate men who awaken, and society fears strength more than weakness. But liberation is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is survival. To live in obedience is to die while breathing. To live in fear is to rot from the inside out. To reclaim your sovereignty is the only path to true life, raw, unfiltered, and uncompromised. The first step is awareness. You must see the chains that bind you, the guilt that governs you, the lies you've been taught to worship. And you must recognize them for what they are, tools, illusions, and distractions. The second step is acceptance. Accept your instincts, your desires, your ambition, your shadow. Do not fear them. Do not apologize for them. Integrate them, use them. They are your fuel, your compass, your power. The third step is action. Discipline your body. Strengthen your mind. Build a life that cannot be dictated by the comfort of others. Forge habits that awaken rather than anesthetize. Seek truth, not permission. This is how the modern slave becomes a sovereign man. This is how the man who was trained to obey becomes the man who commands. This is how chains become meaningless, because no master can control a mind that is unconquerable. And remember this: every philosophy, every historical example, every wise man who walked before you knew the same secret. Freedom is not found outside. It is not granted by laws, society, or God. It is claimed within. The man who awakens from obedience does not need validation. He does not need approval. He does not fear punishment. He is dangerous, not because he seeks power over others, but because he has power over himself. And once that power is claimed, nothing can touch him. The final truth is uncomfortable but liberating. You have been taught to kneel. You have been trained to obey. You have been conditioned to fear. Now the choice is yours: to remain a slave polishing invisible chains, or to awaken, reclaim your instincts, master your will, and stand untouchable. The gods you feared, they are inside you. The chains you worshipped, they are in your mind. The liberation you seek, it is forbidden, because it demands more courage than most men possess. But it is real, and it is waiting. And when you finally claim it, history will bow before the man who refused to kneel. You have been lied to. From the moment you were taught to kneel, the world has trained you to obey. Not just to obey laws or rulers or gods, but to obey fear itself. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of the chaos that comes with freedom. Most men never question it. They carry invisible chains polished by guilt, reinforced by comfort, and disguised as morality. They live lives of quiet desperation, convinced that obedience is virtue, submission is faith, and suffering is proof of righteousness. But the truth is harsher. Obedience without awareness is weakness. Submission without understanding is slavery. Suffering without mastery is meaningless. History has proven this again and again. Every empire that survived was built on obedience. Every empire that fell did so when men stopped kneeling. The lesson is clear. The fate of civilizations and the fate of men depends not on rulers, but on the courage of the individual to awaken. The philosophers who spoke the uncomfortable truths, Nietzsche, Spinoza, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, they knew what most men never understand. The greatest power lies within, not without. To reclaim that power, you must confront everything the world has taught you about weakness, fear, and obedience. Step 1. Recognize the chains. Look at your life honestly. Identify the moments where you surrendered your will, followed comfort over courage, or allowed fear to dictate your choices. This is the first act of rebellion, awareness, because no man can claim freedom he does not first see. Step 2. Confront the guilt. Every instinct, every ambition, every desire you were taught to suppress is not evil. It is the raw material of sovereignty, the anger you feel, the drive to dominate, the hunger for achievement. These are signs that you were never meant to kneel. Embrace them. Transform them. Let them fuel your ascent rather than imprison you. Step 3. Act with discipline. Philosophy is useless without practice. Freedom is not a thought. It is a habit, a choice, a battle fought daily. Strengthen your body, sharpen your mind, and cultivate virtues that cannot be taken from you. Build rituals that reinforce mastery over self rather than obedience to others. The empire of your soul must be constructed before any empire outside can respect you. Step 4. Reject validation. Every system you were trained to obey depends on your need for approval. Your friends, your society, your culture, even your own family, they profit from your compliance. Do not seek permission to live. Do not apologize for your power. Walk alone if you must. Stand uncompromised because the life worth living is never convenient, never comfortable, and never approved by the masses. Step 5. Awaken your inner divinity. The God you were taught to worship outside yourself is a reflection of what you are capable of within. Power, wisdom, creativity, and courage are not granted. They are reclaimed. Every decision, every victory, every act of mastery reconnects you to this inner divinity. The forbidden liberation is simple. Know yourself, own yourself, and refuse to kneel. The rewards are profound. You will see the lies for what they are. You will hear the whispers of obedience and fear and recognize them as illusions. You will act with a clarity that terrifies the comfortable and inspires the brave. And you will live a life that cannot be measured by wealth, status, or approval, only by the depth of your sovereignty. History has always feared such men. Socrates was executed for thinking freely. Giordano Bruno was burned for seeing the universe differently. Nietzsche was scorned for naming the illusions men live by. Every great thinker, every philosopher, every revolutionary understood the same principle. Obedience is the weapon of the weak. Sovereignty is the power of the strong. The modern world has replaced whips with screens, prisons with routines, and fear with comfort. But the mechanism is identical. Every click, every scroll, every distraction is designed to keep you compliant. Every lie you were taught, every guilt you inherited, every instinct you suppressed, it was engineered to maintain control. And yet, freedom is still possible. Because slavery only exists where it is believed. The man who masters himself, who refuses to kneel to fear, to guilt, to comfort, he is untouchable. This is the truth they cannot teach in schools, churches, or corporations. The chains are inside you. The keys are inside you. The liberation is forbidden because it requires more courage than most men can summon. But it is the only path to a life that matters. You will face resistance. The world will punish you for refusing obedience. The comfortable will ridicule you. The fearful will hate you. And even those you love may not understand. But this is the price of sovereignty. No one worth following will ever walk an easy path. No truth worth claiming is ever comfortable. No freedom worth having is ever given. The man who awakens claims his power in full view of history. He does not seek permission. He does not beg for approval, and he does not fear consequences. He acts with conviction, guided by discipline, wisdom, and vision, and he becomes the standard by which all men are measured. So ask yourself, will you remain a slave, polishing invisible chains, living a life of quiet obedience? Or will you awaken, reclaim the God within, and stand untouchable? The answer will define you, not tomorrow, not next year, not when the world allows it. Now. History belongs to the men who refuse to kneel. Philosophy belongs to the men who face their own darkness, and freedom belongs to the men who claim it, against every fear, every lie, every illusion. The cross of obedience has been lifted from your shoulders. The chains of guilt and fear have always been in your mind. Now you have the choice to break them, not by waiting for salvation, not by obeying doctrine, not by pleasing authority, but by claiming your sovereignty. Stand, think, act, and never kneel again. The world will resist, but the awakened man cannot be resisted. He becomes history in motion, philosophy in action, and freedom incarnate. This is the forbidden liberation. This is the reclaiming of the God within. And this is the life worth living.